So today we're going to be sharing practical insights and mindset shift leaders can apply immediately. Dr. Mehta has been with the NHS as a GP for 16 years, has worked within NHS for over 20 years, and offers a wealth of experience and insight in this particular area around well-being and reducing stress and burnout within the workplace. If you feel productive but are always tired, this episode is for you. Welcome, Milan. Thank you for joining us on The People Prescription.
Hi, Rich. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's an honor. I'm looking forward to talking about my REST model and how leaders and organizations can help improve their employee well-being and also take better care of themselves as well.
So just a bit of an intro for Milan. Dr. Milan Mehta is a GP who has worked in GP practice for many years. And we're going to explore today the various aspects of burnout, how we can avoid stressful situations in the workplace and manage those through various aspects of Dr. Mehta's ultimately experience in the years in GP practice, and also look at things like how we can consider coaching in these areas, leadership development, overall well-being and performance. So great to have you with us, Milan.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Right. So in terms of being comfortable with being productive in the workplace, especially for leaders, what I find is there's a huge pressure on leaders to perform ultimately within their organizations. And behind those high performing peoples and teams, there can be really healthy operating systems that organizations can work towards. And it'd be great to focus on that today in terms of what operating systems are actually a useful tool that organizations can adopt to build high performance people within their teams, but at the same time, look after their overall culture within the organizations, their overall health, really. And I always say, a healthy team is a productive one. It's similar to, a happy team is a productive one too. So it'd be great to share some insights today around how organizations can adopt these strategies. I know when we spoke previously, you've discussed things like the REST model, which is all around recharge, exercise, sleep, and giving people thinking time. Can you explain a little bit more about that, Milan, in terms of why sleep matters so much, and also things like memory consolidation and decision qualities, how that REST model, that mini model, can really support people within organizations to have a healthy outlook and ultimately increase performance?
So the problem is we have 4 core pillars of health, which are in the REST model. So the REST formula: re-energize, recharge, which is basically looking at things like nutrition and also making sure that we schedule regular breaks for ourselves throughout the day to allow our nervous systems to just reset so we can tackle the next task. In terms of nutrition, so some really key important things: avoiding foods that just make our sugar levels sort of spike up and then crash back down. We all know that if we have that carb-heavy lunch, we're just exhausted in the afternoon, we can't think properly, we can't focus. So avoiding foods that do that. Having a bit more lean protein, so it gives us more energy, it keeps us feeling full for longer, and it avoids those sugar spikes in our blood throughout the day. So it keeps us sort of working in tip-top condition. We then look at exercise.
Right.
It's more about resistance training, so lifting weights either at the gym or doing body weight training at home and keeping it really simple, because that will lower our cortisol levels, our stress hormone levels. And the other advantage of that is if you do it in the early part of the evening, it actually gets you naturally tired, so you fall asleep easier.
Right.
We then look at sleep. So the key things about that are ideally trying to get somewhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep a day. We know that if we're sleep deprived, and this is the scary part, it increases our risk of cardiovascular problems, so heart attack, strokes. We're at high risk of developing diabetes, depression, cognitive decline, and actually just dying in general from any cause. It's really important to get to sleep properly and to get good quality sleep.
You say good quality of sleep.
Yeah.
What are we talking about there? I mean, are we talking about we've heard stories of Margaret Thatcher living off 4 hours sleep when she was in term and, high performance. A lot of people I speak to, especially leaders, the listeners that are listening in here, they might feel productive, but always perhaps feel tired. This episode, I think, could be for them 100% if they are feeling productive, but are always tired. Like, what would be a healthy amount of sleep for somebody?
So the optimum amount of sleep would be 7 to 9 hours. But again, it's not just a case of just being in bed for 7 to 9 hours. It's trying to get good quality, deep sleep. And to do that involves quite a few things. It involves like having an evening routine so you naturally wind down. So leaders are on the go all day. They're in sort of that leadership mode, and they need to have that routine to help switch off from that leadership mode so they can naturally fall asleep and get that recharge time overnight. And sleep's really important for other reasons as well. So all the things that we learn that go into our memory during the daytime, if you imagine like a USB memory stick getting full,
Yes.
during your sleep, that's where your brain takes all the stuff out of that empty stick memory, empties it and puts it into your long-term memory. So
Right.
if you're not sleeping properly, your short-term memory is full for the next day. So it's really hard to remember things, to process things, make decisions, etc.
And in terms of so giving you the opportunity to, I suppose that rest costs an organization a huge amount. If people aren't resting enough, then poor decisions ultimately are being made. Do you find any link or a pattern that's emerged that where perhaps high achievers try and resist rest, or that what potentially drives them to resist rest?
I think there's a few reasons. I think just generally nowadays, just working every hour that we have in the day and pushing ourselves harder and harder, it's just become the norm now. And leaders especially sort of wear stress as a badge of honor, and all they end up doing is just exhausting themselves, where physically and mentally they struggle to function properly.
So from what I've understood in our previous conversations, there's a lot around how sleep can help with things like emotional regulation, decision quality as well. I always suggest that leaders to try and implement rest as almost a way in which to signal to people, their direct reports, that they're looking after them. If you're looking after your team, they're looking after you. I genuinely believe that pushing that agenda within teams is a great way to build trust within a team. It's a great way to ensure that the decisions made on that team are healthy decisions, and rest seems to be a really strategic asset in that sense. Is there anything, you mentioned a bit about like exercise as well, leading into like a late of an evening to just allow people to wind down and really just expend that energy so they can get to sleep. Are there any sort of ways that you'd recommend people sort of set themselves up for sleep, such as screen time reduction, or any sort of hints and tips you could share there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a firm believer in keeping things really simple, and just by implementing, step by step, one at a time, seeing whether it works for you or whether it doesn't. So just as a rule of thumb, 3 hours before you sleep, try to avoid eating anything, because you don't want to be busy digesting at night time when you're trying to rest and switch off. About 2 hours before you go to sleep, try and avoid drinking any fluids, because actually drinking fluids so close to bedtime, apart from making you get up in the night and go for a wee, which obviously disrupts your sleep, just trying to process that water in your body can affect your sleep quality as well. And finally, in the hour before you go to sleep, just no screens, no devices, just avoid any blue lights, because it will just really overstimulate the brain, which is not what you need when you're trying to go to sleep.
Right, I'm with you. I mean, from a people ops perspective, I can remember speaking to some of my direct reports in the past and asking them to put like a calendar placeholder in the calendar, just explaining this. So if it's 9:30 for some of them, it was a bit later, 30 minutes wind down, it was just getting them ready. So they saw it was like, right, okay, now that I've had that notification, I need to put the phone away, put it somewhere else, and then begin what would be like a habit, getting into the motions of getting ready to sleep. And, that might even be a bit of light movement, perhaps, like you say, reducing stimulants, to avoid them needing to stay up for as long as they need to. And it helps massively with emotional regulation as well. It's a well-rested team is one that ultimately is going to be making good, productive, solid decisions in the workplace. So for any leader watching this podcast, it's really helpful to actually share some of these tips with your direct reports to ultimately make sure that you're shaping what would be the norms within that organization. I appreciate, occasionally there are times where, because of it could be a deadline that's being pushed or a particular objective that needs to be achieved, that somebody might potentially move away from what would be their habit and, the sleep in this case. But there are also benefits of that too, in the sense that because you've built the habit around it, occasionally veering off, would you say that's okay? Is that healthy to do that if there's a particularly big, mountain to climb of a task that needs to be completed? Or would you suggest actually, it needs to be a much more sort of structured less flexible way in which to approach stress management in the workplace.
Absolutely. So I think, as with everything in life, moderation is key. We'll have tight deadlines to meet from time to time. If you're doing it very occasionally, you might sacrifice a bit of sleep just to get the job done. And that's okay for a very short period of time. But it's when you're constantly doing that really frequently, not paying sleep the respect that it deserves, your body and your mind are going to suffer the consequences if you keep doing that all the time.
Excellent. And also, I mean, one thing that pops up a lot when I'm speaking to leaders, especially, is around like multitasking. And would you say that multitasking is a bit of a myth, that, people would benefit more so from focusing on one task and then moving on to the next to maintain good quality? Do you see any concerns that arise around perhaps errors or error rates rising because people are switching between tasks regularly? Is there any benefit of having like focused time on one particular task throughout the day? Or what are your thoughts on that, Milan?
Yeah, so multitasking is a common thing. Most of us will do it at some point and we think we're being hyper productive, but actually the science says the opposite. So the problem is when we're multitasking, studies have shown that actually reduces your productivity by up to 40%. And then when you try and switch to doing another task, it then takes your brain about 15 to 25 minutes to refocus. You're actually losing time. So I think it's better to stick to one task at a time if possible, devote full attention to it. And if you've got similar tasks to do, try and get them out of the way in one go.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people that find it useful to have like time blocking in the calendars where they'll allocate times. Some people I speak to are a bit more ready, recharged in the mornings to do the heavier work. Certainly I'm like that. But then other people I speak to are perhaps more night owls. They'll have time towards the evening or in the later afternoon where they're focused on the deep and heavier work. It's really, it's not a one size fits all approach. It has to be unique to the individual. And I know that's something you help people with as well, which we'll discuss during the podcast. I suppose things that I've come across in the past within organizations that have worked well, there's a lot of discussion around, do we need a 60-minute meeting? Does it need to be a 30-minute meeting? Could it be a 25-minute meeting or return 5 minutes for recovery at the end? There's lots of different ways that people can adapt the way they work to try and build and set people up for the win, as I would say, to make sure they're hitting the rest framework. Delaying sending emails after 7:00, perhaps, of an evening. A lot of clients I speak to, they will still be working past 7:00, especially if they're running their own business, they're working later in an evening. But at the same time, they might schedule send information to their team. I know certainly within the HR doctor, we have caveats at the bottom of our emails to say, I'm sending this email at a time that suits my schedule. We don't expect an immediate response, especially if it's sent outside of core working hours. But are there any areas that you've noticed that are perhaps actually quite helpful for people here around maintaining that thinking time approach or the recharge time within any given day?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's really important that the leaders are very clear about their boundaries, not just around time, but also with their energy as well. So, we only have a certain amount of energy and you want to obviously devote it to the big things, ideally, and you don't want other people or the tasks of constantly stealing that energy away from you. So you've got nothing left for the stuff you really need to be getting on with. There are different ways we can sort of do that. Firstly, we can do things like energy audits. So we can list everything that we do in a day, use a simple traffic light system, red, amber, green, which you talked about before. So if this task fills you with energy, then, code it green. If it's neutral, it's amber. And if it's draining your energy, it's red. And the simple thing is you obviously want to do more of the green things and less of the red things. And there are different ways you can do less of the things that drain you. So firstly, you need to be aware of what they are. And secondly, you can either try and delegate those to other people who can also do it, or possibly even better than trying to automate it.
Yeah, 100%. I think, ultimately businesses, organizations scale not on exhausted brains, but on repeatable habits, and using that red, amber, green feature, I think will be a fantastic way for people to strategically really just plan out a week that's a healthy week for them. And of course, it's unique for them. It's personal for them too. We're all different in terms of where we work optimally. Like I'm more of a morning person. I get a lot of my deep work done first thing of the morning. But, we've spoke a lot there about the sleep aspect of the rest model. So one was to recharge, exercise. From an exercise perspective, I mean, what would good look like there? What would you encourage people to do in order to maintain a healthy amount of exercise?
Again, I think it's a rough rule of thumb. I think
Hmm.
doing some resistance training 2 or 3 times a week is a good start. So just, for example, like a total body workout 2 or 3 times a week. But also on a daily basis, I think it's important to try and get some steps in. And the actual numbers are arbitrary, to sort of, throw around 10,000 steps, but just use that as a
Yes.
rule of thumb. But actually,
Right.
the key is just to, we don't move in society, and they say that sitting is the new smoking, and it has all those health sort of risks as well when we just sit on a
Right.
chair all day long. So
Stuff.
every few minutes, try and get up, move around, stretch, if possible, go for a 5-minute walk, and try and do that regularly throughout the day. And also after we have a meal, you can try and go for a walk for 10 minutes. Again, that's been shown to really sort of curb those spikes in your blood sugar, I think up to 30%. It's important to keep moving every day as well.
I'm with you. I mean, again, leaders shape the norm within an organization. Certainly, I'm a big advocate for walking meetings. I think they're a fantastic way to ideate as well. As you're walking forwards, as a team, there might be several people that are all walking forwards, but there's something in that, I believe, that is very helpful when you're trying to overcome challenges, perhaps that you're facing as a business. That motion of moving forward as well is quite a great way to, I suppose, test progress within a task that's being completed. And if you're doing that on a repeatable basis, then ultimately, you're building a habit. And I appreciate, it takes time to build those habits. But from a leader's perspective, I've mentioned this before in the podcast, a leader in my mind is somebody who goes first. And to be able to show the team that you're leading, that these are the type of areas that you're focused on as a leader, actually is incredibly helpful for them to start building those repeatable habits that are fantastic to ultimately, increase performance and productivity within that organization. So thinking time as well. So talk a little bit more about that, Milan. How does this impact this many model that we're talking about? We're speaking about rest. This is the T within the rest model. What does thinking time mean really from a leadership perspective? How are we using that to our advantage?
So thinking time and also sort of mindset in general. So versus simple measures that, again, become strict about protecting our thinking time. So working out in the day, like you said, you're most productive first thing in the morning. So that's when you want your protected time to do your deep focus work. So working out for yourself, maybe in the morning for some people, maybe in late at night for others, and making it clear to other people not to try and disturb that unless it's an emergency. But also working out if you are engaging in any unhealthy behaviors, trying to work out why is that happening? What's the underlying reason that's happening? Is there something else going on in your life? Any of the stress? One way you can sort of tackle that is by doing a 3-part written process for a few minutes, ideally every morning. So first part is called brain dumping. So literally anything that's on your mind that's sort of worrying you, overwhelming you, making you feel stressed out, don't think about it, just write it straight onto paper. The second part is journaling. And this is where you write down all your thoughts, feelings, experiences, and you have to be open and honest with yourself. It's for your eyes only. And you then spend a few minutes reflecting back on what you've written. And this is really powerful because when you do it every day, it rewires how your brain's thinking about things, literally rewires your thinking. And the advantage of that is that you start coming up with solutions to your own challenges. And the final part is called gratitude practice. So some of you may have heard it before, plenty of science behind it. So this is where you just jot down 3 to 5 things that you're really happy and grateful for. They can be big or small things. And you then spend a few moments just sort of deeply appreciating those things. Do that every day. And the other thing that people can do is meditation. So I know it
Right.
sounds quite woo-woo to a lot of people, but again, there's increasing amounts of scientific evidence building up for it. So why meditation is good is because it just helps you create some mental space between where your problems are and your mind and your thinking. So you can, again, think about everything more clearly, just creates that mental distance. And it's really simple and easy to do. If you just close your eyes, either sitting down or lying down, and just take long, slow, deep breaths. And anytime a thought enters your head, just acknowledge it's there, but try and let it pass through. It is tricky at the beginning. It's a skill you have to keep practicing. And the way that you let the thought pass through is just by going back to focusing on your deep breathing.
Right. Certainly from a personal perspective, meditation's been a huge part of my routine for over 11 years now. And Initially, when I first started, as you shared there, it was challenging. If you've got a busy mind, it can be very difficult to focus on and have that focused attention on the breath. But as with a lot of exercise or activities, the more you repeat that action, the more you get to understand it, the stronger the muscle becomes. And, that's been a fantastic way to, I suppose, again, provide a bit of headspace really in situations where, like you say, if you need a thinking block of time each day, it allows people to, I suppose, approach challenges and with a fresh perspective, and with that headspace is particularly powerful. So I'd encourage anybody to get involved in that kind of activity. We mentioned last time when we spoke also activities such as, was it the Pomodoro method was one? Can you expand a little bit more on that as well in terms of how to sort of build it like a healthy thinking block?
Yep, absolutely. We know that we can only stay really focused on a task for a certain amount of time. And so the Pomodoro technique is where you just set a timer for about 20 minutes or so, and you just work on one task. You then have a little break and start it again. It's about sort of giving your brain that sort of full focus time, but again, giving it that break to recharge and reset so you can focus back on the next thing.
Absolutely. And is there like a checklist that organizations could potentially use to build it? What could be like a simple approach within their, it could be department or within their leadership teams?
I think there's every opportunity for them to do that. And essentially at the end of the day, and just as I think you believe as well, the culture of an organization, it's sort of built, created by its leadership. So if they're not addressing their pillars of health, if they're not managing their stress, that just trickles straight down through the whole organization. So again, they could sit down and work together with just looking at the different sort of 4 pillars and working out which ways can our organization help support our employees. Obviously, employees have a certain responsibility to take care of those pillars themselves to some degree, but these are always good if an organization can find ways how they can support that process, because that's going to be beneficial to them in the long run as well.
Yeah, 100%. What I find as well, leaders who email their direct reports late at night, it can demonstrate to the team or teach the team that recovery is optional within that organization. So things like we shared earlier, like schedule sending information at the time within operating hours, within your core hours, that can be a really big indicator for especially new starts, the people who perhaps are not as used to the culture within an organization, the focus that an organization has on the overall well-being of the team. Because as we said at the beginning, a healthy team is a productive one. Does this impact the nervous system from a biological perspective? Are we talking about creating a safe environment here for people to work? I mean, what would be a good description from how this mini model supports the people's nervous systems?
Absolutely. So this rest formula, all those pillars of health, they just help calm down our nervous system, because when we're sort of facing the pressures every day and we're building back chronic stress, you're constantly in that fight or flight mode. That's great for short-term things. Our sort of acute stress response is a generic system, and it has one purpose. It's designed to make us move. Now, that can mean different things. So that may mean to make us move physically, like to get out of danger, jump out of a car that's hurtling toward us. It can mean to make us move in terms of to say something, to speak, maybe say something which we wouldn't normally have said. And move can also mean to take some sort of action, whether that's, taking action on one of your goals or something like that. But it's when that same system is just constantly switched on, that sort of energy that it sort of expends, it would just eventually lead to burnout. So it's trying to be mindful of that, using it when we should, because it helps us overcome obstacles, meet deadlines and various sort of short-term pressures. But it's when you've always got that system on, that's when it causes problems, in your body and mind, etc.
That threat state, from what you've shared there, it seems that it's a threat state versus a safety state at work. And burnout, perhaps, I think burnout's one of those words, Dr. Mehta, that gets shared quite a lot across social media. And, burnout prevention, I think, is a more healthy way to, burnout really is the destination you don't want to get to, in my view. What can we do within an organization to prevent that happening in the first place? One of the areas I see a huge amount in people ops that can actually feed into getting to that state, the unwanted state of burnout, is change management. We're in a state where it seems that the nervous system, if a change is thrust upon somebody, it can actually put them in that threat state, that kind of fight or flight state. And it can sometimes even feel physically unsafe, where if somebody's suggesting that a particular operation's being changed or a particular standard operating procedure within an organization is being changed. How can we avoid that uncertainty cortisol spike, that stress spike, where if the brain's defaulting to that loop, really, the unsafe loop? What would you suggest people do to avoid getting to that position in the first place? Are there any signals that they can use to indicate, right, okay, we need to do something about this that's going to avoid them going into that sort of threat state?
Right. I think the first key thing is firstly, knowing what signals to look out for. How do I know I'm burning out? And that's obviously key for both the leadership and senior management as well as the employees. So simple signals are, you can't switch off, especially at nighttime. You struggle to make the simplest of decisions. You're just constantly mentally exhausted, even though you've had adequate sleep. And you get all these physical symptoms which have no underlying physical cause. Things like you feel where your muscles are tense, you get tension headaches, you get various sort of, gut digestive issues, and you also get pickups of frequent minor illnesses just because you run down and your immune system is not working at full speed. So being aware of those is really important. Or how organizations, if they can work out ways to help support those 4 core pillars of health. So having the occasional spa day or yoga session is better than nothing, but it's not really going to create lasting, sustainable change in that respect. I think having other things in place, and they don't have to be expensive, and some of them are free. So I think firstly, showing that you are a caring organization and that, your ethos is that you do want to support your employees' well-being. So whether that's just being available to lend an ear if an employee is struggling, teaching employees to help look out for one another, so we can pick up sort of mental health issues earlier on, having an open door. So if someone is struggling, they can speak to somebody and the organization can either signpost or provide some things to help them.
Excellent. I mean, one of the things practically from people ops perspective, one of the things I recommend businesses do, and certainly with our clients, we recommend regular, predictable cadence around whether it be weekly meetings, quarterly meetings, monthly meetings. They certainly, in my view, be like ad hoc pep talks. People tend to like certainty. So with that, making sure that if you're having a meeting with somebody, we recommend doing very clear agendas, so that people understand the purpose of the meetings. If there are going to be tense aspects of the meeting, raising those beforehand, so they've got an opportunity to perhaps even self-appraise first, if it's an appraisal, for example. And time boxing, we spoke a little bit about already, but it's very helpful so people understand when things are occurring within the week and they understand what the next steps are. One thing that we also suggest as well is we're a huge fan of versions within the HR doctor, and versions really are our way to make people aware of, we're not saying we must or we should do things, but actually we're looking for the best way. We're trying to learn together to achieve the outcomes we're looking to achieve. So that could be, a 2-weekly review. It could be checking in on, we use things like objectives and key results. So very clear OKRs around like what the person's role is. And with that certainty, even though we might be implementing a potential change to their role or a change to the outcomes they're trying to achieve within the role, it's done in a way because the cadence is there. It builds the predictability around it, and it creates a safe space for people to discuss challenges that they're facing, obstacles that they need to overcome. And it encourages what would be very healthy communication, which is a really key part of any organization. And it can actually help to reduce that, as you were talking about, that sort of fight or flight response within an organization. Reduce the nervous system sort of natural response to a possible perceived threat, which actually, I know we spoke before about like public speaking, for example. Would you mind just explaining a little bit more about that in terms of how, and this is something, I mean, again, I was listening to a podcast only at the weekend and there was a chap talking about this was public speaking again. It was a stand-up comedian effectively that was, a stand-up comedian doing his routine, doing his bit. And he was on stage. There was another chap that was a lion tamer of all things based in Africa. And prior to the gig, the lion tamer approached the stand-up comedian and essentially said, look, I don't know how you do what you do. It's the most terrifying thing for me that could be possible as a lion tamer, to step up in front of a group full of people and have a conversation with them or present information to them. The irony was, of course, that the comedian was like, look, you tame lions for a living. What more, ever high? But he was completely comfortable doing that. But if you put him up in front of a group of people, that for him was like a huge threat. So I think, certainly public speaking for many, many people is one of those areas that, can actually create an imbalance in the nervous system. What would you recommend that people can do to transform that fear into something a bit more productive?
I think there's a few things to understand first. So firstly, our subconscious mind, its job is just to keep us safe. And
Right.
the way that it keeps us safe is just by keep us doing the same things we're always used to doing, because that's what it thinks it's safe. That's great in some ways, but the flip side of that is that it prevents us growing.
Right.
It's only when we get outside of our comfort zones, that's where we develop, we grow. And sometimes we have to force ourselves to do that. So for example, as you say, we have to give that big presentation. We know we have to do it, but something's holding us back. Something is making us feel very uneasy. And that's your subconscious mind's way of trying to keep you safe. It's making you feel that sort of uneasiness inside your body. There's some different ways of sort of dealing with that, coping with that. First is just reframing your thinking. So instead of thinking or telling yourself, oh, I'm really nervous, feeling really panicky, you could tell yourself that actually, this is my body's way of making me want to get up on stage and share what I have to say, because it's going to help my audience. Instead of saying, I'm nervous or panic stricken, this is my body's way of telling me I'm excited to do this. So just reframing the way that you're doing things. And again, just to help calm down the nervous system a bit, which is what you're feeling at the time before the big presentation. Just simple things. So, often tell people to use box breathing. So, you close your eyes and breathe in for 4 seconds, hold your breath 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold your breath 4 seconds. And you do 2 or 3 cycles of that, and it slows your heart rate down. So it make you feel a lot calmer. And then also, I think it's important to say that some people are natural introverts, some people are natural extroverts. You can be both, which a lot of people don't realize. And if getting up on stage and talking is sort of against your grain, as an organization as well, is trying to work out, well, how can we offer support to that person if this is now part of the role? And we know that it's not their most favorite thing to do. Can we give them any help with either practicing any keynote presentations they have to do, or put them in touch with somebody who helps with presentation skills? When you do all those things together, it can help them all.
100%. What I find is, in my view, working in people operations and HR, it's about making sure that people tend to be resistant. Most resistance is rational. What they tend to resist is the surprise, not necessarily the improvement that's being suggested. So as you were sharing there, giving a team member, a direct report, somebody you're trying to support, an improvement, and framing it in a way that we're trying to help you actually is a fantastic way to avoid that kind of fight or flight response where people do resist the surprise of wanting or needing a change to take place within an organization. So giving people a safe place to have conversations and ultimately, making it predictable for them where they can have those regular conversations with their team lead. It's a fantastic way to reduce that cortisol spike, that fight or flight response, and reframing it to excitement as well. Again, fantastic way to handle it. From a people ops perspective, a lot of what I see is around the alignment piece, that people perhaps sometimes, if they're feeling stressed or if they're getting close to burnout, it's asking them the question, like, what's important to them? Understanding, is that aligned to the way the role that they're currently performing is designed? Is that enough in itself to motivate them? And motivation, it is fleeting. It's not always there. Discipline, I believe, is the way forward, really. But at the same time, there needs to be a strong alignment in people ops to how they're aligned to the mission that an organization's on, the vision that the organization has in terms of what they're trying to achieve, or that could be something relating to the problems that they're trying to solve. And misalignment symptoms can sometimes pop up in burnout as well. From a practical perspective, I know we spoke previously about when we're doing sort of appraisals and performance reviews with people, making sure that they are aligned and making sure we're asking the right questions. And what would you suggest? Do you see that yourself in GP practice, that perhaps people, that what's causing the stress, what's building up that scope for them to become burnt out is an alignment issue? Is there any weight in that, do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely do use a lot of weight to that, because a lot of people work really hard, but why do some people seem to do it absolutely fine and some people burn out? And often one of the big reasons is because the things they're doing every day, their daily actions, are not aligned with their core values, the things that are really important to them. So think, organization, whether it's sort of interview level, makes it very clear what they're about, what they're looking for. Because if that's not really aligned with what the candidate is important to them, you've got a mismatch straight from the get-go, and that's going to probably cause problems later on. So you want to make that clear, and you want to try and get the best match, and you want to find out either at interview stage or onboarding what things are important to them. What skills are they good at, that they enjoy doing, that they're enthusiastic about. In terms of sort of going back to general practice, when I was a partner and I did the annual appraisals with the nursing team,
Yes.
we'd always ask about, as a practice we can help support any educational needs, any training needs, anything you want to upskill on, how can we help you? So obviously we know that they're staying fulfilled in their job, and that's going to increase job satisfaction and productivity, and everyone's happier.
Yeah, 100%. And similarly as well, for organizations that are doing continued performance development reviews, so that could be weekly sit downs, could be quarterly reviews, asking, the person who's in the session with you, is there anything that they do differently? That's a really good way to engage and make sure that people are aligned with the work that they're doing. A lot of the time, the best ideas come from those that are on the cold face of delivering the service or selling the product that the business is involved in. And that can be a great way to assess as a leader, is that person culturally aligned with the mission and the vision that the business is working to? Certainly, one thing I find in practice around the more modest size enterprises, they don't always have the opportunity to share that vision and that mission with people on their team. With your extensive experience in NHS practice, and is that something you see that happens in NHS where that information's conveyed, or would you say that there's an assumption that people understand the mission that they're on with the working in GP practice?
I think people understand the mission. They're taking the NHS as an example. The culture within that has changed a lot. Like even in the 20 years I've been in the NHS for, so we want to help people, and I think everyone in the NHS wants to help people, but because the conditions are becoming less and less favourable, and
Right.
people getting worked harder and harder, there's less funding coming to the NHS, like lots of different reasons, and I don't want to go on a rant about that, but that's clearly going to have an impact, on frontline staff.
I'm a huge believer in looking at somebody's circle of influence and focusing on the tasks that they know they have influence over. I know when you and I have spoken about, alignment, you mentioned before about this wheel of life analogy where people have different aspects of career and health and finance and relationships. So it's not just one thing, and it very rarely is. It's very rarely that simple that it's one thing that's creating the stress or the burnout. I find that this alignment piece is quite a big one that many organizations can miss sometimes, because they assume that people get it. From a more holistic perspective, would you mind just explaining what the wheel of life is and how that can help people to understand themselves perhaps more, or align themselves with, I suppose, buckets of life that need filling up?
Absolutely. So the wheel of life is a tool that's commonly used in coaching. It's been out for a long time. It's very simple, but it's highly effective. So as you mentioned, there's all those key areas of our life. So, our health, our career, finance, our relationships, both romantic ones or friends and family. But also those are ones that most people know of, but there's other ones as well. So personal development, your physical environment. And it's time to do a bit of a self-audit here. So for each of those areas, ask yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied am I with each area? That's the first question. The second question is, what number would I ideally, realistically like in each sort of area to get up to? And then what I suggest is if you pick the top 3 ones that have the biggest sort of gap, the biggest discrepancy, take those 3 and then just start doing some, sitting down, journaling, thinking about it in more detail and working out, well, actually, how can I improve that number? And what steps can I take to increase those numbers? And then start taking those small baby steps and start working towards them. And the problem is if you say, a 9 out of 10 in your career, either your health or your, relationships with your family and friends are like at a 2, that's not balanced. That's not going to be a good life. And that's going to cause big problems later on if it isn't already.
I'm with you. This is relevant for me at the moment because I'm spending a bit of time on looking at exercises that can promote and encourage innovation within organizations. And one of these exercises relates to how much fun somebody's having. And fun, people might look at like this, oh, we've been playful, are we going back to school again? But actually, there's a lot of research that's gone into this around how creating a fun environment can actually spark some of the best ideas within an organization. So we've heard of, I do workshops sometimes with using Lego bricks, as an example. And, in all fairness, I'm probably not up to the point of looking into fun. I've probably not played with Lego since the early teens. But actually, but what I do find is that it brings people together in a way that it can be very useful for innovation. It can be very useful for overcoming challenges and building collaboration, actually. It's fantastic for collaboration. So when we talk about, you spoke quite heavily there about like the career side, the health side, the life side, friendships. But actually, is fun part of that? Is it contribution part of that too?
No, absolutely. And so apologies, that was the other key area. So fun and recreation. So, what sort of sports or hobbies or stuff outside of work or the home life do you like doing? Because again, that's all part of keeping you balanced.
Right. And again, these are things that are actually, if we're looking about, okay, well, what can make a big difference? Just looking at these areas of somebody's life, not everybody takes stock of this when they're busy doing what they're doing. We've got families, we've got responsibilities. These are things that people can sometimes neglect, but actually has a huge impact overall on how they can realign themselves to the work that they're completing and make them feel a bit more safe as well when they're doing it, because they know that they've taken stock. And, this time of year, the beginning of the year, a lot of people are making these resolutions and putting things in place. But actually that exercise in itself is a really powerful way that you've shared to just make sure that they're aligned for the next 12 months or beyond to actually what does fill their cup up. So from a leadership perspective then, I mean, things like you mentioned appraisals, doing a sit down with somebody to make sure that they are, even if it's just a 15-minute alignment around like, do they want to experiment with something within the organization that could potentially help them deliver the service that they're providing, or look at a different way, divergent thinking is quite a popular tool now within business, like a different way in which to approach an old problem. And that can be a great way for people to find more meaning in the work that they do, but also it empowers them too. Would you say that people get a bit more, I suppose, control over how they want to approach work in situations like that? When we look at like truths within organizations, what I see a lot is people tend not to burn out from too much work. They burn out from doing too little meaningful work, or that they have too little control over. So we were speaking about, looking at those different aspects of the buckets of the wheel of life. This gives people more influence, more empowerment over the work that they're doing within the organization. Is that something that you've seen in practice as well? Where have you got perhaps a story you could share with us where somebody's taken these principles and effectively used them in a way that's put them in a position of feeling healthy, of feeling engaged in the work that they're doing, and ultimately adding, I suppose, a layer of safety to the work that they're doing as well?
Yep, absolutely. So somebody I worked with, very sort of driven business entrepreneur and very successful. He was always looking for the next venture, the next sort of big win. But by the time he came to see me, this guy was exhausted. He was like averaging 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night, and he could barely think straight. In fact, after our first meeting together, I literally had to give him permission and tell him to go straight home and go to sleep. Like, don't switch your laptop on, because like that was the priority. And the thing is, each time he was going for the next sort of business venture, he thought he'd feel more valued and respected each time he did that. Each time he became more successful. But actually, all he was doing was chasing the next dopamine hit. So for a short period of time, yeah, he would feel sort of valued and respected. But then, as soon as that feeling faded, he'd then go back to square one. And all that sort of repeated process the cycle ended up doing was just making him feel absolutely exhausted. So we literally had to go back to basics and had to go back to those, the rest formula, those 4 core pillars of health, and start working on those. And, initially we improved his sleep and then improved his focus. He could start thinking clearly for the first time in a long time. And then with time, he just started showing better at home, at work, and he reprioritized everything that was important to him in life. And it just re-emphasized the point that actually if those four core pillars aren't in place, if they're not respected, just everything in life starts to fall apart. So really important.
One thing I see a huge amount with certainly leadership skills, if we can develop leaders that are mindful of these aspects of what we're talking about here, productivity goes up, sustainable performance is there, the leadership development piece, actually making leaders aware and empowering leaders aware of time poor leaders. There can be sometimes an illusion that, being constantly active is creating impact. And that isn't always the case. There's an illusion of productivity because people feel like, well, I'm doing something, I must be achieving things. But that focused attention we spoke about earlier, that kind of meditative approach of being able to use it, and even like if it's the calendar, if you want to use time blocking as an example, where you're having that focused attention, it can create such an exponential value to an organization of having, say, 4 focused hours of deep work compared to 8 hours of work that's quite chaotic and, you're switching from task to task. That's quite a powerful way to approach work. And, you touched on energy audits versus like the actual time audits, being able to track energy that people have at certain times of the day by activity. Again, a great tool. But I'd be saying to leaders, if they are feeling busy, but they're not necessarily being effective, then perhaps some of these tools that we're sharing now are going to be very helpful for them to avoid the burnout situation. I mean, I've had examples of leaders sharing with me that they've tried to introduce a lack of an evening as part of their wind down. They'd be having a bit of it, like they might even have a bath or something like that to really sort of calm the nervous system down, get them ready to sleep. But because of the nature of the habits that they get into, they're very busy people. They've always got to be doing something. But actually, it's having an impact on the quality of the work that's being produced as well, because they're not giving themselves that space, the headspace that we spoke about earlier, but also the physical space to work effectively. I mean, have you got any suggestions there that you could perhaps put forward to give people more, I suppose, mindfulness around energy, the time, the focus on, and how leaders can actually support their direct reports with this kind of challenge, really? I think it's an epidemic. A lot of people, certainly senior leaders, have this illusion really of productivity where actually it's not the activity. Yes, they are active, but is it making an impact? Perhaps not. No, so it's understanding that and understanding the values around it as well. I mean, what would you suggest if we've got a leader like that that's trying to do things to reduce stress, reduce burnout? They're implementing things where they're taking a bath of an evening just to try and calm down and chill out, but actually the mind's racing constantly and they feel constantly drawn to doing something.
No, absolutely. So I think, people try those are simple measures, or, going on a spa day or a holiday, and think that as soon as I've had that holiday or done this thing, my stress will go back down to normal and also recharge and I can tackle everything. But actually, and you wonder why things never actually change, is because you haven't addressed the underlying root causes. You haven't worked out where the stress is coming from. You haven't done things to help sort of calm down your nervous system, which is just constantly being switched on and sort of putting you in overdrive mode, if you will. So there are plenty of things, you can do. So leaders, because they have so many responsibilities and so many different decisions to make and things on the go, they need to have that routine once the work, finishes, or they're done at the office. Like, they need a routine to help them sort of mentally switch off. It's not that they're broken or they're doing something wrong. They just don't know what to do. For example, one reason why they can't switch off easily is because their brain's still on the go. They're thinking about, I can't forget about all these things that I need to sort out, or when are they going to get sorted out? So you can tackle that again just by simple writing exercise. So what things are on my mind? When am I going to address it? Or who am I going to ask to delegate it to, etc. So as long as there's a plan for everything, your mind can then sort of relax, and it's not sort of going to be analyzing everything overnight and sort of worrying about things and keeping you sort of awake.
When you and I spoke before, I know we're both fans of Daniel Priestley. He's got a lot of information online around how he sort of builds a solid week, through auditing, as you mentioned there, writing things down. And one of the key takeaways I've taken from watching some of his material is around this kind of rule of 3, which for a weekly, pick 3 outcomes for the week, perhaps 3 per day, and then say no to the rest and keep focused on those 3 activities per day, or the wider, the bigger picture 3 activities outcomes for the week, and focus on those. Make sure you're aligned. I was watching something of his the other day that was talking about doing it like a Monday review, and then looking back of a Friday afternoon, just retrospectively for the week. Did we achieve the 3 things that we've set out to achieve? That's been a good week. But building, it seems to me that consistency is the key thing here. It's about building that, like you say, the one-off, I'm going on a spa weekend to chill out, might not necessarily be enough to reset somebody's nervous system. It needs to be a regular, other aspects of work that can be offloaded to somebody else. If it's repeating, can you use automation? That kind of understanding initially as well can be quite useful. And, from a people ops perspective, one of the things that we offer is things like with the HR Doctor, we do like a weekly planning template, just to make it clear that, look, if you want to look at building your leaders or building your direct reports into a consistent, high-performing team, then maybe looking at some kind of a planning template or a planning framework so they can use that and spend, 30 minutes of a Monday just working out, okay, well, what would a good week look like this week? And then checking on it 15 minutes on a Friday afternoon just to establish that, have we set out to, has it led to better judgment, better recovery as well? So you feel a bit more open to calming down and necessarily, I hear this a lot, when people say sometimes doing nothing is actually doing something. For individuals that are high performers that do want to do things and who are constantly wanting to be active, that can be a very easy thing to say, but a very, very challenging thing to achieve. For certain people, certainly people I know in the entrepreneurial world and entrepreneurship circles, they're constantly on the go. And you see this. And again, we're creatures of habit, I suppose, aren't we? Is there anything you could help or recommend people do if they're watching the podcast that can kind of break that habit in a healthy way?
So I think as leaders, business owners, business professionals, we're all used to setting up business KPIs, for the year, those business metrics. What most people don't do or don't dedicate enough time to is actually what are your life KPIs? Because there should be much more important. Because you've got a misalignment there, again, it's going to cause stress and problems. So what I should have said before, but actually one issue with leaders is that they're sort of often running just on caffeine.
Absolutely.
People will be thinking about it. So in terms of what's recommended, a bit of caffeine is good for you. It does help. But the key points are, if you can minimize it to 2 or 3 cups of tea or coffee a day, and ideally try and have them before sort of midday, 1 p.m, because it will still be in your bloodstream when you're trying to fall asleep, which you don't want.
Right.
So that's important. And then in terms of everything we've discussed so far, which will hopefully help people, I think we're both fans of James Clear and Atomic Habits. So, he talks about habit stacking. Using an existing habit and then using that to add in a new habit. So for example, say if my routine is to have a morning coffee after I wake up, my new habit that I would sort of habit stack to that would be, whilst I'm drinking my morning coffee, I might do a bit of journaling every morning, and then that's easy to build in that new habit.
Right.
I would suggest to anybody, in terms of, I guess, how to get the most out of this podcast, is if you go back to the REST formula and look at those 4 core pillars, work out which one do you really need to address most urgently right now, and then look back through those sections of this podcast and look at all the tips and strategies we've talked about and pick just one and focus on doing that 3 to 4 weeks, and then know has it helped you, has it not, and then move on to the next step. Now, everyone is wired differently, our bodies work differently, so every tip is not going to work the same for everybody. So you need to work out for yourselves, which ones are going to help you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I use things like the Eisenhower matrix for understanding, really. For those that are watching, the Eisenhower matrix allows you to understand what's urgent, what can be delegated as a task. And ultimately, if everything's urgent, then nothing becomes strategic, really. So in that sense, leadership can be a design problem that can be addressed through, making sure that people are focused on the tasks that are actually moving the needle rather than things that are urgent but not necessarily important to do at that time. So a lot of people, the feedback within people ops around, it could be a concern around workload or it could be, the amount of work that they're completing, is just too high. They believe it's too high. But actually, when we look at it and we really sort of peel back the layers of the onion, the problem that we're trying to resolve, it can actually be a design problem. I love design thinking. I think it's a great way to approach not just, building a good life, as you were saying there about, what buckets do you want to fill, but also a good business and a good organization. So that design problem thinking is actually a great way to approach leadership. It's about giving people tools so they can understand, okay, well, what is urgent today that needs attention? And of course, the most urgent things aren't always actually strategically the most effective things to be working on. And once you understand that, then it gives you room as a leader to think, okay, well, maybe I need to be delegating this to somebody else. And, does that lead into other considerations around somebody's, most entrepreneurs I speak to are control freaks. I am. It's one of those things, it's inbuilt in people. They have a certain standard, but, the power sometimes can be in actually releasing some of that and say, look, you're empowering your team to get involved with it. And with that particular task that you feel that you need that control over. So, and it's easier said than done. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of time and design around how to move away from that mindset. But broadly, if you're not comfortable as a leader delegating that to your team, then it's not going to give you an opportunity to focus on the strategic tasks that need completing, that perhaps need that higher level focused attention thinking, deep work thinking to address the longer term strategic decisions that have an impact on not just one situation, but potentially ripple effects on thousands of other situations, which of course that means it's higher leverage. So are there any sort of hints and tips that you can give to people where they are, as myself, very focused on wanting to achieve quality, wanting to make sure that there's a drive there, but perhaps do have some reservations about offloading certain tasks to people? A very common thing that I speak to leaders about.
So again, I think it goes back to the organizational culture. You don't know what you don't measure. So there's a few reasons why employees, feel stressed at work. So firstly, if they don't know exactly what their job role is, if they're just not clear, again, that causes stress. Obviously, if their workload isn't appropriate for them and they're feeling too pressured or the deadlines are too tight and too frequent. But also if they feel like they're not heard. This isn't like a broad sweeping generalization. A lot of businesses, truly do care about their employees and try and take care of them.
Absolutely.
But some will go through just a tick box sort of approach. Well, okay, we've done this wellbeing measure, this wellbeing measure, or we've asked these questions, we've checked in on them, but they don't actually listen to them and do something about it. So if someone feels like they're not being listened to, but they're not being heard, that's not really a very good feeling either. So that's something organizations can do more about. And again, it doesn't cost them anything extra.
It ultimately builds trust as well, doesn't it, Milan? With the team, if people understand that it might not always be implemented, the suggestions that are being made, but if they understand that there is that acceptance of the feedback and that it's been taken on board, then it can be implemented as part of that, as we were speaking earlier, that design problem thinking of how can we improve and ultimately become a better version of whatever task it is that they're being asked to complete. From what you're sharing here, it seems that a lot of what we've spoke about relates to coaching, development, building those sort of scalable cultures within organizations. I know certainly when we look at from a people ops perspective, what's the leadership pipeline like within an organization? What's the learning culture like? Is there a talent strategy in place for succession planning and build the next generation of leaders? I know when you and I spoke before, you mentioned you do an 8-week coaching program. Would you mind just sharing a bit more around how that can help with things like balance and sustainable performance with organizations?
Sure. So the thing is, like I said before, most leaders aren't broken. They're just working too hard. They're running on adrenaline and caffeine, and they're paying for it. Their sleep is poor. They can't focus, and they're having short fuses both at home and at work, and that obviously has a wider impact with the family and things. What my 8-week coaching does essentially is helps them regain that sort of clarity and balance, energy, and helps them get control of their emotions back again as well, so they can think more clearly and show up better at work and at home. I mean, essentially what I do is, firstly, we spend the first couple of weeks just really doing a deep dive and working out where is the stress coming from and where is it leaking out performance. We work on sort of sleep and setting boundaries and all those sort of things. And instead of just randomly guessing where the problem is, we then just help them rebuild sort of daily systems, which helps them take them out of that constant fight or flight mode. And actually just within first couple of weeks, they can usually notice an improvement in their sleep and focus just by, altering the physiology and calming the nervous system down. Afterwards, we sort of stress test all those techniques we've talked about and things in the battlefield. So how are those things we've talked about, how are they helping them have those difficult conversations, manage their workloads, and all those sort of things? How are they showing up at home? Are they feeling more present with their family? They're co-creating a plan how they can sort of table those things long term as well. So just helping leaders think more clearly by the end of it.
From what you've shared previously and what you've described there, it seems that the coaching's a big part really of a mindset shift really in terms of an organization, how they can build on it. One thing I find a lot that happens within teams is that where training is being offered, but it's not necessarily being implemented, then it can really reinforce, I suppose, the theatre aspect of coaching or training. And what I found really important actually about what you were sharing is that you're supporting, you're facilitating, you're helping to implement that, which ultimately then could be rolled out across a leadership team. It could be absorbed into culture within an organization. So that development that the leaders have also actually sticks with some of their direct reports as well, which again has a massive impact on how you can then influence that organization and the shift that it has for overall healthy, sustainable performance as well. And the peer practice seemed like a big part of what you were doing on the coaching side, that you were helping with, facilitating that coaching as well, which was fantastic. Are there any aspects of what we've shared so far today, any sort of themes and trends, like from a practical takeaway perspective, that you notice within leadership teams, within people teams, where perhaps there are signals that if this is occurring within your organization, that particular organization perhaps needs some help, perhaps even some external help with addressing those points? I mean, immediately, just to give you a couple of examples, we've spoke about emails outside of working hours. A big one that's popped up certainly within the HR doctor company. We get lots of questions towards the end of the year. People have banked up lots of annual leave, but they've not necessarily taken the annual leave, so that can stockpile. We spoke rest is a big part of that. Would you say there are other signals that could potentially happen where you think we need to rein this in as an organization? Perhaps we need to consider some external support with this?
I think there's a few questions sort of organizations and HR leaders, people ops leaders need to sort of ask themselves. So firstly, as an organization, what are we doing to help support our employees' well-being? So a simple question, but you need to really just sit down and think about how we're doing it and how can we do it better? And, if your organization as a leader, if it rewarded you for being sort of calm and focused as much as it does for whatever outputs you produce, what behaviors would you need to change to become a more calm and focused leader?
In terms of ways to get in touch with you, so Milan's current work and programs, which points to things like the 8-week program, do you have any sort of upcoming events that you'd like to point people towards as well? Of course, we'll make sure that we have all your follow details, LinkedIn details as part of the podcast, and website details, of course, too. But have you got any upcoming events that you'd like to share some action interest points or any tickets that will be available?
Yes, I do. So on Thursday, 16th of April, 2025, there's an event called Strive Revive ST25. And basically it's a corporate wellbeing experience. And I've been asked to guest speak there. So it's basically aimed at local business leaders, HR leaders as well. So if that's something that would interest you to not just learn about well-being, but actually to experience it with sort of, there's talks there, there's practical workshops as well, then we would definitely recommend you grab a ticket and you can message me and I can put it through to get in tickets if that.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, certainly I'll be attending that event as well. So look forward to seeing you there, Milan. It's been great to have you on the podcast today for the People Prescription. Just to wrap up today, if anybody needs to get in touch with Milan, we'll be leaving all the details below. So if you have anything like website details, we'll include that below, newsletters, ways to connect with you on LinkedIn, of course, too. And really looking forward to that event at Bet365 in April, which will be fantastic. And anything in terms of pointing towards your flagship 8-week program, we'll make sure that's included too. And really appreciate you joining us today on the People Podcast. Been fantastic to understand a bit more. You've got a wealth of experience, 20 years in GP practice and, understanding a bit more about, as you say, some of the more simple, effective ways that people can adopt to reduce stress and burnout within the workplace, I'd recommend people connect with you on your socials as well. So really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich, for having me. It's been a pleasure.